And here's the grades example, a little bit longer. He says, suppose there were a group of students who have studied during a year, taken examinations, and received grades between 0 and 100, which they have not yet learned of. They are now gathered together, having no idea of the grade any one of them has received, and they're asked to allocate grades among themselves so that the grades total to a given sum, which is determined by the sum of the grades they actually have received from the teacher. Right? So suppose that you all took your exams, right? So there's 10 of you took exams, uh, graded between 0 and 100, and I don't tell you what you got as individuals, but I do tell you what the sum of all of your grade points is. So suppose I add up all of your scores, all 10 of your scores, and the overall uh, score is 820. So you know that as a class, you got 820 out of 1,000 possible points. All right, so that's what Nozick has in mind here. Okay, so now back to the quote. First, let us suppose that they're to decide jointly upon a particular distribution of grades. They're to give a particular grade to each identifiable one of them present at the meeting. Here, given sufficient restrictions on their ability to threaten each other, they probably would agree to each person receiving the same grade, right? To each person's grade being equal to the total divided by the number of people to be graded. So in our example, right, there would be a very strong reason for you all to choose that each of you get 82, right? Because that would be 820 divided by 10. All right. Now Nozick says, surely, in any case, they would not chance upon the particular set of grades they already have received. Now next, let's change the case a little bit. Next, suppose that they're unanimously to agree not to a particular distribution of grades, but rather to general principles to govern the distribution of grades. And it turned out that the total was variable depending on how they divided it. Right? So in the imagined scenario, right, suppose I told you that if you allowed for some inequality in how you assign grades to each other, the total number of points you could work with would be 900 instead of 820. Okay? So then you could arrange it in a kind of difference principle following way. Now, what's the point of this example for Nozick? Well, according to Nozick, in this situation, A, the students would probably choose the difference principle, right? Because it does seem pretty rational in the scenario. But, and this is why this is an objection to Rawls, he says this would be an unfair way to distribute grades. Right? Notice that we don't. in fact, we don't, distribute grades in this way. Right? Why? Because we think it would be unfair. Well, that's one reason. All right, so what's the point? Well, the intuitive force of these examples is that the difference principle is weird because we wouldn't actually want it to govern, for example, how parents distribute attention to their children or how teachers distribute grades to students. So doesn't that show that it's kind of not a good principle in general? Well, I mean, look, Rawls is very clear that the difference principle, he doesn't say that this should be the principle of distribution we use for everything, but only for designing and assessing the fundamental institutions of a society. Right? And that seems like an important, meaningful difference. Right? Like in the context of a game show, right, we might think that the fairest way to distribute rewards is based on random chance, right? Spinning a wheel or flipping a coin or whatever. Right? But just because that method of distribution works in a game show doesn't mean that we should that should guide our fundamental institutions, right? So it does seem like there's a real difference here that Rawls can appeal to. But here's what Nozick says. He says, we're more secure in our judgments about justice in micro or kind of small situations. So those should guide our thinking in macro situations too, right? So Nozick says, look, we should look at examples like the family example and the grades example, figure out what works there, and then that should be our model for what we demand of our fundamental institutions. But again, who knows how persuasive that is given the game show example we just considered. But Nozick also says that in general, the correct principle of justice should hold universally. Right? So we should find a principle that kind of applies to all of these cases. And he doesn't think that the difference principle can do that. All right, so what should Rawls say in response? Well, I think you can imagine that conversation going a few more steps, and I leave it to you to fill that in. All right, so there's the first kind of big objection specific to Rawls from Nozick. The next objection, I think, is a very interesting one. All right, so here's Nozick starts here by quoting Rawls. So Rawls writes that, quote, the initial endowment of natural assets and the contingencies of their growth and nurture in early life are arbitrary from a moral point of view. The effort a person is willing to make is influenced by his natural abilities and skills and the alternatives open to him. The better endowed are more likely, other things equal, to strive conscientiously. All right, here's Nozick. It says this line of argument can succeed in blocking the introduction of a person's autonomous choices and actions and their results only by attributing everything noteworthy about the person completely to certain sorts of external factors. So denigrating a person's autonomy and prime responsibility for his actions is a risky line to take for a theory that otherwise wishes to buttress the dignity and self-respect of autonomous beings. One doubts that the unexalted picture of human beings that Rawls' theory presupposes and rests upon can be made to fit together with the view of human dignity it's designed to lead to and embody. Right now, there is a real tension here that Nozick is pointing out. Right? I think this is a fascinating set of issues to consider. Right? Rawls, the general questions here are these. Can you rationally maintain a basically Kantian approach to moral philosophy, including political philosophy, while acknowledging the profound impacts of contingency and luck on humanity, and the serious limitations on whatever freedom and or rationality that we possess? Right? That's what Rawls is trying to do here, right? He has this kind of Kantian view of, we shouldn't be treated merely as means, we have dignity and we're worthy of respect and all this. So he wants to hold on to those nice insights, but while acknowledging that contingency and luck and serious limitations are real, right? Are a real factor, and it's an open question whether you could do that, right? And this is what Rawls is trying to do, and I think it's a large part of what Honora O'Neill was trying to do in her piece that we read months ago, especially when she talks about how autonomy can come in degrees, right? I think she's grappling with some of the same issues that Rawls is. And Nozick's right, that this is a tough project to pull off. So I kind of figure out what you think about this, and then let me know what I should think, because it's really tricky. So yeah, let me know what I should think about this. The third objection is summarized in this passage here. I'm just going to leave this one to you all to work through. All right, so read this, please, and then tell me what Nozick's objection is, and then what can or should Rawls say in response. Okay, this is the collective assets objection. Please let me know what to think about it. And the final objection that I will talk through, and this is implicit throughout the Nozick, goes something like this. Given that we have strong property rights to certain things, according to Nozick, any redistributive policies will run afoul of Rawls's first principle of justice. Right? Remember, Rawls claims basically that liberties can never be violated for the sake of anything else. Right? Not for utility, not for equality, not anything. Right? That's the force of the priority of liberty claims. Right? You can't violate liberty for the sake of equality or utility or whatever, efficiency, blah, blah, blah. Now, Nozick's idea here is that, look, one of the liberties that we have that should be protected by Rawls's first principle is the kind of liberty to do what we want with our private property, something like that. Right? So if that's how we should understand liberties and the relationship between liberty and property, then it's going to turn out that Rawls can never claim, for example, that redistributive tax policies are just, and so it'll turn out to be impossible in practice to actually realize the difference principle, and that by Rawls's own lights. Right? If all instances of redistributive taxation involve violations of what Rawls should think of as our liberties, then by Rawls's priority of liberty, we can't engage in these redistributive tax policies, and if that's the only way we can make the difference principle real, then we're never going to be able to satisfy the difference principle, right? Because it would be a violation of liberty. Now, of course, Rawls would and does deny that one of our basic liberties is the liberty not to be taxed, right? Rawls thinks it can be rational to agree to certain government programs, namely the ones that would be required in order to realize the difference principle, in the original position, right, from behind the veil of ignorance. So Rawls is not going to say that that's one of our fundamental liberties, But what Nozick's saying here is that we as the kind of reasonable observers, we might want to think of the freedom to do what you want with your private property and not to have it be taxed for the benefit of others, as Nozick would put it. We might want to think of that as one of our key liberties. And so if you do think of that, if you do think of property, the relationship of property to liberty in that way, then you will think that the